There is a quiet mistake many men make without noticing. They explain themselves too early, too often, to the wrong people, not because they are dishonest, but because discomfort pushes them to justify their choices, their silence, their limits. What feels like clarity slowly erodes authority. This tension is not a flaw in your character, it is a signal. Explaining does not always create understanding. Often, it trades strength for relief, and relief is expensive. The first principle: if you explain your long-term goals to everyone, you quietly dismantle the gravity they require to exist, not in a dramatic way, not all at once. It happens gradually, through exposure. A goal that is spoken too early stops being internal discipline and becomes external narrative. You are no longer moving toward something. You are maintaining a story about where you are going. Why does a man explain his long-term goals? Rarely because someone demanded it, more often because silence feels uncomfortable. Silence creates ambiguity, and ambiguity makes weaker minds nervous. Explaining feels like control, but it is usually a reflex to reduce tension. You speak so others won't assume you are lost. You speak so your stillness doesn't look like stagnation. You speak to avoid being misjudged. But authority has never depended on explanation. It has depended on outcome. When you explain a long-term goal, you invite people who will never walk the road to comment on the direction. Their feedback is not malicious. It is limited. They evaluate your future using their present. They measure your ambition using their tolerance for risk. And every question they ask subtly shifts your internal posture. You begin defending instead of building. There is a psychological trap here. Explaining goals gives the illusion of progress. You talk, people react, you feel acknowledged. That acknowledgement releases pressure, and pressure is what forces consistency. A man who explains too much often works less afterward, not because he is lazy, but because his nervous system already received a reward. The mind confuses expression with execution. Watch what happens after you explain a goal. You start tracking how others perceive your progress. You become aware of timelines you never agreed to. You feel compelled to update, to justify delays, to explain adjustments. The goal becomes social before it becomes structural, and once it is social, it is vulnerable. History has already tested this pattern. The men who reshaped industries, territories, systems did not narrate their direction while walking it. They were misunderstood, dismissed, ignored. Not because they lacked clarity, but because clarity does not require consensus. The world only understands trajectories in hindsight. Before that, it resists them. There is also the issue of interference. When people know your long-term goal, they unconsciously try to optimize it for comfort. They suggest alternatives that sound reasonable but dilute the original intent. They introduce safety where danger was necessary. They offer balance where imbalance was required. And slowly, without noticing, you begin negotiating with your own vision. Consider a real situation. A man plans to leave a stable environment to build something uncertain. If he explains this to 10 people, 8 will question the risk, not because it is wrong, but because it threatens their understanding of stability. Even supportive voices will frame concern as care. And care, when misaligned, still creates friction. The quiet man avoids this entirely. He does not owe clarity to observers. He owes execution to himself. His goal remains heavy, unresolved, demanding. No applause, no reassurance, just pressure. And pressure, when carried correctly, becomes precision. Explaining long-term goals also exposes them to premature judgment. People evaluate seeds as if they were trees. They ask for proof before conditions exist. They demand certainty where exploration is required. And every time you respond, you are pulled out of the work and into defense. This is not secrecy driven by fear. It is restraint driven by respect. Some things are weakened by air. Some plans need darkness, repetition, and time. A long-term goal is not a promise to others. It is a contract with yourself. Silence is not absence. It is selection. The second principle. Explaining your personal boundaries is often the first step toward losing them. A boundary that requires justification has already been negotiated. The moment you feel compelled to explain why you will not tolerate something, you signal that the limit is flexible, conditional, open for discussion. And discussion is where boundaries go to erode. Why do men explain their boundaries? Because refusal creates friction. Saying no without explanation feels harsh. It feels socially dangerous. There is a quiet fear that silence will be interpreted as arrogance or hostility. So the man explains, he softens, he offers context. He hopes understanding will replace resistance. It rarely does. When you explain a boundary, you invite interpretation. The other person no longer hears a limit. They hear a position, and positions can be argued with. They look for exceptions. They test timing. They push emotionally instead of directly. What was once a clear line becomes a psychological negotiation. History has already tested this as well. Authority never came from being understood. It came from consistency. A man who holds a boundary without explanation forces others to adapt. A man who explains teaches others how to bypass it. Consider how boundaries are treated in real life. At work, a man who says, "I don't take calls after this hour," and stops responding is respected, even resented. The man who says, "I don't usually take calls late because I have family commitments and I wake up early," receives sympathy and then receives calls anyway. The explanation becomes leverage. The same pattern appears in personal relationships. When you explain why you need space, why you won't engage in certain conversations, why you won't accept certain behaviors, you shift the focus from the boundary to your reasoning. And reasoning invites challenge. People don't cross firm walls. They test padded ones. There is also an internal cost. Explaining boundaries forces you to relive the discomfort that created them. You reopen decisions that were already settled. You re-enter emotional territory you intentionally left. Over time, this weakens resolve. You start adjusting boundaries to avoid repeated explanations rather than to preserve integrity. A man with solid boundaries understands something subtle. Boundaries are not meant to educate others. They are meant to structure behavior. They work through repetition, not persuasion. When enforced calmly and consistently, they require no defense. Notice the contrast. One man explains every limit, hoping to be fair. Another simply acts within his limits and lets consequences speak. One is constantly negotiating his own space. The other occupies it. This does not mean aggression. It does not mean hostility. It means clarity without performance. You are not responsible for how others feel about your limits. You are responsible for maintaining them. Boundaries that are explained are boundaries that can be appealed. The man who understands this stops arguing for his own perimeter. He draws it once, steps inside it, and lets silence do the work. The third principle. Explaining your life philosophy weakens it, not because it is wrong, but because a philosophy only works when it is lived, not translated. The moment you start explaining how you see the world, you reduce something internal and operational into something theoretical and debatable. You turn a way of being into a position. Why does a man explain his life philosophy? Often because he feels pressure to justify his choices. He does not drink, so he explains discipline. He does not chase approval, so he explains independence. He does not follow the usual script, so he explains perspective. The explanation is not for clarity. It is a defense against misunderstanding. But misunderstanding has never been fatal, dilution has. A life philosophy is not meant to convince others, it is meant to govern you. When you explain it, you invite comparison. People immediately measure it against their own beliefs, their habits, their comfort. They look for inconsistencies. They ask why you don't bend here, why you are rigid there. What began as internal alignment becomes external debate. History has already tested this pattern. The men whose lives carried weight did not explain their worldview in speeches. They embodied it in decisions. Their actions confused people long before they impressed them. And confusion is not a problem. It is often the natural response to coherence in an incoherent environment. There is a deeper issue beneath explanation. When you explain your philosophy, you risk seeking validation for it. You want nods, agreement, recognition. And the moment your philosophy needs approval, it stops being a compass and starts being a costume. You adjust it depending on the room. You soften edges. You emphasize what sounds reasonable instead of what is necessary. Consider a man who values restraint. If he explains this openly, people challenge it immediately. They call it cold. They call it repressed. They project their discomfort onto his discipline. Now he has a choice. Either he defends himself endlessly, or he begins modifying his behavior to avoid constant friction. Both outcomes weaken the philosophy. Another man says nothing. He lives quietly, consistently. Over time, people notice patterns. He is steady. He is predictable in the right way. He does not react. He does not overextend. He does not collapse under pressure. No explanation was required. The philosophy revealed itself through behavior. Explaining a life philosophy also freezes it prematurely. A philosophy should evolve through experience. When you articulate it too clearly, too publicly, you feel pressure to stay consistent with old versions of yourself. Growth becomes awkward because change looks like contradiction. Silence allows refinement without announcement. There is also the matter of audience. Most people do not want to understand your philosophy. They want to categorize it, label it, reduce it to something manageable. Once labeled, it is dismissed or tolerated, never examined. Your explanation saves them the effort of observation. A man with a functioning philosophy does not broadcast it. He lets it constrain his choices, his time, his energy. He lets others feel its effects without being invited into its logic. A life philosophy is not an argument. It is a filter. The moment you feel the urge to explain how you see the world, ask yourself who benefits from that explanation. Often, it is not you. The fourth principle: explaining your past mistakes keeps them alive longer than necessary, not in memory, but in identity. The moment you begin narrating your errors, you allow them to define you beyond their usefulness. A mistake should be a lesson, not a biography. Explanation turns it into a story you are forced to carry. Why do men explain their past mistakes? Usually out of a desire to be transparent, or to preempt judgment, or to show growth. There is an assumption that explaining failure demonstrates maturity. In reality, it often signals that the failure is still unresolved internally. History has already tested this. Men who survived collapse did not spend their lives clarifying it. They corrected, adjusted, and moved forward. The past became a data point, not a conversation topic. The ones who explained too much stayed psychologically tethered to what no longer existed. When you explain a mistake, you reopen the emotional context that created it. You relive the confusion, the weakness, the miscalculation. Even if you frame it as a lesson, the nervous system does not distinguish explanation from repetition. You are training yourself to revisit a state you were meant to leave. There is also the social consequence. Once people know your past mistakes, they reference them, subtly, sometimes kindly, sometimes strategically. Your error becomes a coordinate they use to orient themselves around you. You are no longer simply present. You are contextualized. Consider two men with the same failure behind them. One explains it openly. He tells the story, emphasizes what he learned, frames it carefully. The other does not hide it, but does not narrate it either. He behaves differently now. He chooses differently. One carries his past in language, the other carries it in correction. Explaining mistakes also invites interpretation you cannot control. People simplify your experience. They extract conclusions that were never yours. They reduce complexity into moral lessons that do not apply. And once that interpretation exists, it follows you longer than the mistake itself. There is a quieter cost as well. Explaining mistakes can become a way to seek absolution. You speak so others will reassure you that it was understandable, forgivable, human. But absolution from others does not remove internal residue. Only discipline does that. A man who has integrated his past does not need to explain it. His behavior no longer matches the error. That is explanation enough. He does not deny what happened. He simply does not rehearse it. Real growth is visible without narration. It shows up in restraint where there was excess, in patience where there was impulse, in precision where there was chaos. These changes do not need context. They stand on their own. Your past mistakes are not secrets to be hidden. They are weights to be set down. And the more you explain them, the more you keep lifting what you were supposed to leave behind. The past only has power when you keep giving it a voice. The fifth principle: explaining your financial decisions weakens your position long before it affects your money. Finances are not just numbers. They are priorities made visible. And the moment you explain how you spend, save, invest, or withhold, you expose your hierarchy of values to people who do not share the same discipline. Why does a man explain his financial decisions? Often to avoid judgment, to justify restraint in a culture addicted to display, to explain why he does not upgrade, does not participate, does not follow the expected pattern. Money is one of the fastest ways people measure status, intelligence, and competence. Silence in this area makes others uncomfortable, so they push for explanation. But explanation invites interference. When you explain a financial decision, people immediately interpret it through their own habits. If they spend freely, they see your restraint as fear. If they avoid risk, they see your investment as recklessness. If they live for appearance, they see your simplicity as lack. Their reaction is not insight, it is projection. History has already tested this pattern. Men who preserved wealth did not defend their decisions publicly. They moved quietly. They ignored commentary. They understood that financial strategy cannot survive constant exposure. Attention distorts incentives. It pressures consistency where adaptability is required. There is also a strategic cost. When people know how you manage your finances, they adjust their expectations. They feel entitled to explanations when you say no. They assume capacity when you choose not to spend. They resent restraint because it reflects their own lack of control. Suddenly, your money is no longer neutral. It is social. Consider a simple situation. A man chooses not to join certain activities because he is allocating resources elsewhere. If he explains this, people respond with opinions. They suggest alternatives. They question priorities. They frame sacrifice as imbalance. And now, every future decision becomes a conversation. Another man declines without explanation. He is not rude, he is firm. Over time, people stop asking, not because they understand, but because they adapt. Silence trains others faster than reasoning ever will. Explaining financial decisions also creates psychological pressure. Once you justify why you are doing something with your money, You feel obligated to maintain that justification. Changing strategy feels like contradiction. You hesitate to pivot because others remember what you said. Silence keeps you flexible. There is also the danger of comparison. The moment you explain your financial logic, people compare outcomes prematurely. They judge decisions before cycles complete. They mock patience because they worship immediacy. And if you listen, you start questioning decisions that only needed time. A man with financial discipline understands something uncomfortable. Most people do not want to understand your money choices. They want to validate their own. Your explanation gives them ammunition to do that. Money requires privacy to remain strategic. The more public it becomes, the more emotional it gets. And emotion is expensive. You do not owe clarity about your finances. You owe consistency to your plan. Results speak when they arrive. Before that, silence protects the process. Financial restraint does not need defense. It needs time. The sixth principle. Explaining your emotional restraint makes it disappear. The moment you begin clarifying why you do not react, why you do not express what you feel, why you remain composed, you convert discipline into defensiveness. Restraint only works when it is observed, not justified. Why does a man explain his emotional restraint? Because calm is often misread. Silence is interpreted as indifference. Control is mistaken for detachment. And rather than letting misunderstanding exist, he feels the urge to correct the narrative. He explains that he does feel, that he does care, that he is not cold. In doing so, he exposes what was meant to remain contained. History has already tested this pattern. The men who held authority under pressure were not the most expressive. They were the most predictable in crisis. Their value was not in how much they revealed, but in how little the situation could move them. Emotional restraint was not explained. It was demonstrated repeatedly. When you explain restraint, you teach others where to apply pressure. They learn which emotions you are suppressing. They discover what triggers you are managing. What was once a sealed system becomes transparent. And transparent systems are easier to destabilize. There is also an internal erosion that follows explanation. Emotional restraint requires constant regulation. It is active, not passive. When you begin justifying it, you shift energy from regulation to narration. You start monitoring how others perceive your control instead of maintaining it. Over time, this creates cracks. Consider a common scenario. A man does not react to provocation. Someone pushes. He remains still. The silence is heavy. If he explains afterward why he stayed calm, he relieves the tension for everyone else. He reassures them, but he also reduces the weight of his restraint. The moment loses its authority. Another man remains silent and moves on. No explanation, no clarification. The discomfort remains unresolved, and that unresolved discomfort becomes a lesson. People remember how small they felt in that silence. They adjust. Explaining emotional restraint is often an attempt to appear humane, but humanity does not require exposure. Control does not need apology. A man is not obligated to perform his inner life for others' comfort. There is also a cultural trap. Modern environments reward emotional transparency, but punish emotional stability. The man who explains how deeply he feels is celebrated. The man who regulates without commentary is questioned. One is easy to understand. The other is difficult to manipulate. A restrained man understands that emotions are not meant to be broadcast. They are meant to be managed. He does not deny their existence. He simply refuses to outsource their interpretation. Restraint loses power the moment it asks to be understood. Calm does not explain itself. The seventh principle. Explaining your silence destroys its purpose. Silence is not empty space. It is pressure. And pressure only works when it is allowed to remain unresolved. The moment you explain why you are silent, you convert tension into information. You replace impact with commentary. Why does a man explain his silence? Because silence unsettles people. It removes feedback. It denies reassurance. Others begin projecting meaning onto it, and that projection makes them uneasy. To relieve that unease, they demand explanation. And too often, the man complies, not because he must, but because discomfort feels like conflict. History has already tested this pattern. Silence has always been one of the strongest forms of authority. Leaders who spoke less forced others to think more. Their absence of words created gravity. When they finally spoke, it mattered. Silence was not avoidance. It was selection. When you explain your silence, you neutralize it. You reassure others that there is nothing beneath it. You tell them it does not mean distance, judgment, or refusal. You give them certainty, and certainty removes leverage. Silence works because it leaves room. Explanation fills that room too quickly. There is also a psychological inversion that occurs. Once you explain your silence, you take responsibility for other people's discomfort. You signal that their need for clarity outweighs your choice to withhold. Over time, this conditions others to expect access to your inner process. Silence becomes something you must justify instead of something you own. Consider a real situation. A man stops responding immediately. He slows communication. He observes more than he reacts. The room changes. People become cautious. They read into his pauses. If he explains that he has been busy, reflective, or overwhelmed, the tension dissolves. But so does the respect. Another man remains silent and consistent. No dramatic exits, no explanations, just reduced availability. Over time, people recalibrate. They speak more carefully. They assume less. Silence trains behavior without instruction. Explaining silence also exposes intent. Once people know why you are quiet, they adapt their strategy around it. If silence means you are thinking, they wait you out. If it means you are hurt, they placate. If it means disinterest, they escalate. Silence loses its unpredictability. There is an internal benefit to unbroken silence as well. It allows thoughts to mature without interruption. It prevents premature disclosure. It keeps you from reacting while still processing. Explanation interrupts this cycle. It forces clarity before clarity exists. A man who understands silence does not use it theatrically. He uses it economically. He does not punish with it. He does not threaten with it. He simply allows it to exist until something worth saying emerges. Silence is not absence. It is selection. The man who explains his silence gives away the one advantage silence provides. The eighth principle. Explaining your self-improvement process interrupts it. The work of correction requires isolation, repetition, and error without witnesses. The moment you begin describing how you are changing, what you are fixing, what you are working on, the process shifts from internal discipline to external narrative. Improvement becomes something you talk about instead of something you endure. Why does a man explain his self-improvement? Because effort is lonely. Because discipline has no immediate proof. Because others ask questions when behavior changes. You wake earlier, train harder, withdraw more, refuse distractions. People notice. Silence invites curiosity. Explanation feels like relief. But relief weakens momentum. History has already tested this pattern. Men who rebuilt themselves did so quietly. Their transformation was not collaborative. It was private, often misunderstood, sometimes criticized. Improvement required friction, not affirmation. And affirmation arrives too early when you explain. When you explain your process, you externalize accountability. People begin watching. They expect consistency. They expect updates. They expect visible progress. And when progress slows, as it always does, pressure replaces patience. You feel compelled to perform improvement rather than submit to it. There is also a neurological cost. Talking about change creates the illusion of change. The mind receives satisfaction from articulation. You describe your discipline, your routines, your mindset shifts, and your nervous system registers completion where none exists. This dulls urgency. The work loses sharpness. Consider two men trying to correct the same weakness. One explains his routine, his strategy, his commitment. He receives encouragement. He is seen as disciplined. The other says nothing. He disappears earlier at night. He is unavailable. He repeats the same behaviors until they become automatic. One manages perception, the other manages structure. Explaining self-improvement also invites advice that does not apply. People project solutions based on what worked for them, not on what you require. They suggest moderation when extremity is needed, balance when imbalance is corrective, comfort when discomfort is the point. And if you listen long enough, you begin compromising the very conditions that made improvement possible. There is another risk. When you explain your process, you lock yourself into language. If you later adjust, pivot, or abandon a method, it appears inconsistent. You hesitate to change because others remember what you said. Silence preserves flexibility. Growth demands it. A man improving himself is not becoming something new. He is removing what interferes. That removal is rarely impressive. It is repetitive, unglamorous, and slow. Explaining it invites evaluation before results exist, and evaluation distorts effort. Self-improvement is not a message. It is a constraint you live under until it no longer feels heavy. Speaking about it lightens it too soon. Work that matters does not announce itself. The process survives best when it is allowed to remain unseen. The ninth principle. Explaining decisions that upset others trains them to expect influence over your choices. The moment you justify why you decided something that inconvenienced, disappointed, or frustrated someone, you imply that their emotional response has authority over your direction. And once that implication exists, it never stays contained. Why does a man explain decisions that upset others? Because discomfort escalates quickly. Someone reacts emotionally. There is tension in the room. Silence feels like escalation. Explanation feels like de-escalation. He speaks to calm the situation, not realizing that calm purchased this way is temporary and expensive. History has already tested this pattern. Leaders who lasted were not the ones who explained every unpopular decision. They absorbed backlash without rearranging their spine. They understood that not all negative reactions indicate error. Many indicate disruption of expectation. When you explain an upsetting decision, you move the focus from the decision itself to the emotional state of the person affected. You are no longer discussing reality. You are negotiating feelings, and feelings, unlike facts, have no endpoint. One explanation leads to another. Clarification becomes appeasement. Appeasement becomes dependency. There is also a shift in power that occurs quietly. Once people know you will explain yourself when they are upset, they learn to use upset strategically. Emotional reactions become tools. Disappointment becomes leverage. Silence becomes accusation. Your decisions stop being evaluated on merit and start being evaluated on how well you manage reactions. Consider a simple situation. A man makes a decision that limits access to him, less availability, fewer favors, tighter standards. People react. If he explains that he is busy, overwhelmed, or trying to improve his life, he temporarily smooths things over. But he also signals that pressure works. Next time, the reaction intensifies. Another man makes the same decision and does not explain. He remains calm, he does not argue, he does not justify. Over time, people adjust or leave. Both outcomes reduce interference. His decision stands without defense. Explaining upsetting decisions also creates internal doubt. You replay the situation. You wonder if you were too harsh, too rigid, too unfair. Not because you were wrong, but because you absorbed the emotional noise of others. Noise clouds judgment. Silence protects it. There is a deeper truth here. Many people are not upset by your decision. They are upset by the loss of access, control, or predictability. Explanation does not fix that loss. It only delays acceptance, and delay prolongs friction. A man with direction understands this tension. He does not seek conflict, but he does not fear it either. He allows disappointment to exist without rushing to resolve it. He knows that emotional reactions burn out faster when they are not fed with explanation. This does not mean cruelty. It means stability. You can be respectful without being transparent. You can be firm without being verbose. The world does not need to agree with your decisions for them to be correct. When you explain decisions that upset others, you turn leadership into consensus seeking, and consensus is fragile. Some decisions will always create resistance. The man who stands by them quietly teaches others how to treat him. Authority does not negotiate with emotion, the 10th principle. Explaining your sense of direction weakens it before it is tested. Direction is not a map. It is an internal orientation that only becomes visible through movement. The moment you explain where you are headed, why you are choosing that path, and how you know it is right, you turn something instinctive into something theoretical, and theory invites doubt. Why does a man explain his sense of direction? Because certainty without explanation makes others uneasy. People are comfortable with confidence only when it is familiar. When your direction does not match the expected route, they ask questions, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to reestablish predictability. Explanation feels like cooperation, but cooperation in this case comes at a cost. History has already tested this pattern. Men who altered their trajectory rarely had language for it in advance. They felt a pull before they could justify it. They acted before they could explain it. And only later, after results emerged, did direction become legible to others. Direction precedes clarity, not the other way around. When you explain your sense of direction, you expose it to premature analysis. People ask for reasons that cannot yet exist. They demand logic before outcomes. They want guarantees where only conviction is possible. And if you attempt to satisfy them, you begin questioning instincts that were never meant to be debated. There is also a psychological reversal that happens. Once you explain your direction, you feel obligated to defend it. Every obstacle becomes a challenge to your narrative. Every adjustment feels like inconsistency. You hesitate to adapt because adaptation looks like uncertainty when others are watching. Consider a man who feels the need to change environments, priorities, pace. He cannot fully articulate why. He just knows staying is erosion. If he explains this, people respond with practicality. They ask what he's running from. They suggest waiting. They label intuition as impulse. And slowly, his internal signal is drowned out by external noise. Another man moves quietly. He changes routines. He shifts focus. He reduces explanations. People speculate, but he does not correct them. His direction solidifies through action, not dialogue. Over time, the movement itself answers questions he never addressed. Explaining direction also invites comparison. People measure your path against theirs. They evaluate speed, milestones, visible markers. But direction is not linear. It is corrective. It involves detours, pauses, regressions that make no sense from the outside. Explanation creates expectations that reality will violate. A man with a strong sense of direction does not need to convince anyone of it. He follows it long enough for it to become undeniable. Until then, silence preserves clarity. Noise distorts it. There is a discipline in not explaining where you are going. It forces you to rely on internal alignment rather than external approval. It keeps you accountable to movement, not agreement. Direction is proven by distance traveled, not by reasons given. The man who understands this walks without narrating. If this way of thinking sharpens you instead of soothing you, subscribe. Not for noise, not for motivation, for discipline that holds when explanation fails.